Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, April 4th, 1841, at 12:30 a.m., President William Henry Harrison dies at the White House, the first commander-in-chief to die in office. His term is famously also the shortest for any president, 30 days. And the story goes that he died of complications from getting sick during his inauguration when the weather was lousy and he gave this incredibly long speech and he was unshielded from the elements, and they say should have worn a hat, but not so fast. That is a great story, an old wives' tale maybe, but Harrison's death was probably not due to that long speech he gave in the lousy weather. And moreover, this story is really interesting because it brings up all sorts of questions about the Constitution at the time and the wrinkles about succession and power, and a sliding doors question of what kind of president would William Henry Harrison have been had he survived more than 30 days. So let's talk about all the things that people don't tend to talk about when discussing the death of William Henry Harrison. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
I want to emphasize another part of my biography as we're starting here, which is that I am, as you all know, a native Hoosier, and William Henry Harrison is our guy. He was like the governor of the Indiana territory, and we don't have any Hoosier presidents. So growing up in Indiana, everyone's like, this is ours, right here.
This
William
is
Henry Harrison. We got
all
30
for 30 days.
Yeah. He forgot to wear a hat, but don't forget. Never mind that part.
It still counts.
But wait, okay. So I'm good friends with this guy Jim Hamblin, who's a doctor, and one of his main things is he said he never wears a coat when it's cold out, and he says it's BS. This whole thing about like you should wear a coat, like you're not going to get your core temperatures are going to drop when you're not wearing a coat as you're going to the grocery store or whatever. So there is this theory out there that maybe backs up this idea that it really wasn't about how well clothed William Henry Harrison was. I'd like to wear a coat outside. I'm assuming growing up in Indiana, Niki, you were taught to wear a coat and a hat when the weather's lousy.
Due respect to Jim, I don't think the conversation was about core temperatures. I think it's really uncomfortable to be outside when it's cold without a coat.
I have to say, there is no way in the world you are going to convince a black mother that is not true. Because living in Massachusetts, I tell my kids all the time, like, hat, coat, scarf, gloves, like the whole 9 yards, and they will go out like a marshmallow out into the winter.
Yeah. Comfort is one thing, but health is another, right? That you're not going to catch a flu because you're a little cold out. And keep saying that. That's fine.
Yes. I'm also thinking of, now that Kellie has painted this image, the movie A Christmas Story, where Ralphie's little brother is like in this enormous layers of clothing, also set in Indiana.
Yeah, there's something to be said. I mean, I get on my kids if they are walk around barefoot. I'm like, put on socks. Your nose is going to run. I'm always emphatic about that. So, yeah, this story is interesting to me because I would have put money on the inauguration. I would have.
Well, let's lay out the sort of most apocryphal old wives' tale kind of version of this. And I don't know if this has been dramatized, but imagine that this is a version that would show up in a movie or whatever. But basically, it's Inauguration Day. The weather is lousy outside. William Henry Harrison is adamant that he wants to show strength. And so his handlers are beseeching him to put on a coat and a hat and maybe be covered up. And he says, no, I'm going to go out there. I'm going to show strength. And moreover, he goes out there and he gives, and this is true, he gives a very, very long inaugural address, 8,445 words in this lousy weather. And then he comes back, he starts to get sick, cut to 30 days later, and he dies. And everyone says he should have worn that hat. I think we got to go beat by beat in sort of debunking this a little bit. First one is the weather that day. Not that bad, actually, as it turns out.
53 degrees, is that right?
48, I think.
48 degrees. 48 degrees, that's not... I mean, it's jacket weather for sure.
Right.
But 48 degrees, like, that will not kill you. Put it that way.
Right. And the speech was long, but... I mean, people didn't have television. Speeches were often long in those days. They tended to go on for a while. And so there wasn't anything... I mean, yes, it was one of the longest that there had ever been, but it wasn't like so egregiously long that people are like 8 hours in the... we can't call it freezing temps, but 8 hours in 48-degree weather. That's not what we were looking at.
Yeah. In terms of also just a sense of like, oh, he gives this speech and then immediately starts to get sick. He went to 3 inaugural balls that night. He may have reportedly been still wearing the same clothing he wore outside. It was a little damp. He drank a lot at the inaugural balls, so we're starting to pile in all the other factors that may have led to this as well. But yeah, 48 degrees, a little rainy, not like... You may want to bundle up a little bit, but not, I don't think, the story that people have in their heads about the conditions on that day.
Also, he doesn't get sick for 3 weeks.
Oh, well, there's an interesting tidbit.
That feels important.
It's a little delay. It's just a little bit of a delay.
Yes. I mean, I think that is the most important tidbit here, is that he does not get sick for a number of weeks. And then when he does, it goes pretty fast, to dying in the beginning of April. So what is it, as best we can tell, that actually leads to his illness?
I mean, it's kind of a gross explanation, but typhoid fever. I mean, people believe that the sanitary system was not great, and so people were putting like human waste and sewage in what was meant to be used as like drinkable water, and I'm just like, oh, it makes me want to throw up when I think about it. But like, if he was drinking contaminated water, that'll do it, and that'll do it fairly quickly.
And this is something we've talked about on the show before. Washington, people slag it for being a swamp, but the real problem is that it has contaminated water. And this has been a problem for presidents in the past, that it's just not a healthy environment. And it's part of the reason why presidents are trying to escape to different places, because the city is not a healthy city during this period.
Cover your ears if you don't want to hear some gross stuff, but here is the physician's report that was issued on April 4th about his illness in the end of March and the first couple of days of April. But it says, quote, pneumonia with congestion of the liver and derangement of the stomach and bowels was ascertained. The stomach and intestines did not regain a healthy condition, and on the 3rd day of April at 3:00 p.m., profuse diarrhea came on, under which he sank at 30 minutes to 1 o'clock on the morning of the 4th, when he then died. So, as best you can determine there, profuse diarrhea is the cause of death there. Probably,
he didn't get that from standing in the rain.
No, he did not get that from standing in the rain. It is probably something to do with the water supply, enteric or typhoid fever. In those times, he's also being given laxatives and mercury and opium to try and help him. It is a rough scene.
Why laxatives if you have diarrhea?
I don't know. Again, there's been a lot of sort of re-reporting, and fairly recently, right? I think just in the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of looking back and saying, okay, what is the new evidence when we look at it with kind of modern epidemiology? And it seems like, yes, it was probably this fetid marsh, I guess, not far from the White House that was leading to the water supply that really led to his demise.
Hey, our Radiotopia colleagues, the Kitchen Sisters, have a new episode I think you'll want to check out. It's called Buildings Speak, Stories of Pioneering Women Architects, hosted by Frances McDormand. Trailblazers, groundbreakers, skyscraper visionaries, little-known stories of Julia Morgan, Natalie DeBlois, Amazalie Meredith, women who changed the skyline and the built environment that surrounds us today. Listen to the Kitchen Sisters present everywhere you find podcasts and at kitchensisters.org.
So, let's talk about a couple things with regards to his death. One is the succession sort of chaos that ensues, and then I do want to just circle back to who he was, what kind of president he might have been, and so forth. But, among other things, we say this is the first president to die in office. The country's not that old at this point. Mm-hmm. And as we've said so many times on this podcast, or as we've learned so many times in this podcast, usually you recognize that the Constitution has gaps in it when something happens and someone flips open the book and says, wait a minute, we're not really sure.
Yeah, I know we're supposed to venerate the Constitution and the founders and all of these things, but they were not very clear on what happens next after a president dies. It was really unclear, in particular, whether the vice president just becomes president or whether they're kind of acting president until you select another one. And that's a really important detail. Who's running the country and for how long? Important question. Now, the vice president, John Tyler, was like, I think that I have discerned the answer to this. I'm president now until the next election.
And that's pretty much what they do. They swear him in. They're like, oh, okay, sure.
Yeah. So he claims full title. And then he takes office as the president on April 6th. A joint resolution of Congress then in May confirms his position.
Which I love that idea that okay, we just need to cover ourselves here because we're not entirely sure. Let's just pass some legislation.
Yeah. And it's not until the 25th Amendment in 1967 where they kind of clarify this because this sort of procedure of being an acting president and then getting confirmed was kind of the one that was in place for more than 100 years at this point.
Also, a long time to clear that up. I feel like you discovered the problem in 1841.
Right. And then it wasn't until Kennedy gets killed they realize it's still a problem, and then they finally do something.
That's wild.
John Tyler, he kind of breaks with the Whig Party a little bit over some tariffs, and they start referring to him as His Accidency.
Which is great.
I think that's the most disrespectful nickname I've ever heard in my life. That is incredible.
And yet I kind of love it.
I love it. Yeah.
No, it's great. But to refer to someone as His Accidency, I mean, oh my God, that is so...
I feel like the rhythmic play on His Excellency is the thing that makes it work so well.
Yes.
Can you imagine John Tyler hearing them?
Right.
People call him that?
He's writing in his diary. They called me His Accidency again today.
I heard that.
Exactly.
I know.
I mean, but we're lucky there wasn't a shooting because I feel like that's how they used to settle slurs like this.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Let's circle back to Harrison himself. He gets 30 days in office, but, his candidacy really was a kind of, I think, a turning point in many ways. I mean, the way that he campaigned as a Whig in 1840, it kind of laid the foundation for a lot of modern tactics. He really understood how to use modern media. He was out there on the trail. And then he was positioned to himself as he's a Hoosier. He was positioned himself as a sort of log cabin and hard cider candidate, really trying to connect with voters in an emotional way rather than just on policy. So, I don't know. Can you think back to 6th grade, Niki? What did they tell you about Harrison?
Well, first of all, that song, that was his campaign song, because, again, he's an innovator on the campaign trail, Tippecanoe and Tyler, too.
Sure.
I can still hear that in my head. I don't know if it's something that everybody knows, but the Tippecanoe and Tyler, too, was something that very much sticks. So that suggests that it is it's a good sloganeering. But I also think that the thing that is overlooked is Harrison had big plans when he came into office. He had a vision for how government should work. And interestingly, he has this big plan for how government should work, and the presidency is not the center of it. The Whigs, he was part of the Whig Party, and the Whigs thought that the president should be weak and that the Congress should be strong, that you should have big government, but it should be centered in the legislative branch. And so you could imagine that had he stayed in power, he would have been a president willing to cede executive authority to Congress while still supporting really activist government. But, there wasn't time for that.
Yeah. I think, he's also living during a time in which the oppression against Native Americans is peak. I think about Andrew Jackson's coming not too long after him. And when he gives his campaign sort of speeches, he does impressions of Native Americans, which I was like, yikes.
Not great.
A lot. And then he sort of credited as being the person that killed Tecumseh. So when it comes to his relationships with Native Americans, not so great.
Yeah. And of course, 1840, the Whigs. And eventually, it's the sort of disagreement over how to handle the slavery question that fractures the party and leads to the rise of Republicans. Lincoln started as a Whig, for example. One final interesting detail is Niki painted this picture of him as like someone who believed in the power should rest with Congress and not with the presidency. And much of his speech laid out that vision about how he would not veto Congress and the will of the people was best expressed through Congress. He had also pledged in that speech to not serve more than a single term, which is just a real kind of poignant irony. He did not serve more than one term. Yeah, he fulfilled that pledge.
He fulfilled it early on. Real 100 days are there.
But it is really, really interesting.
Okay, my last Harrison tidbit.
Please.
As you know, I'm a huge fan of the show Parks and Recreation, which takes place in the fictional town of Pawnee, Indiana. They do have an episode that is about William Henry Harrison and the attempt to sort of like make his legacy and his birthplace a tourist destination, and trying to find enough Harrison artifacts, given his 30 days in office, proved to be a challenge.
Why was he called Tippecanoe?
Because he was the hero of the Tippecanoe battle, where he faces off against Tecumseh.
And that's a part of Indiana. That's an area in Indiana, is Tippecanoe.
Tippecanoe County. Might be a river, but it's also like the battle site.
But Tippecanoe and Tyler too, certainly. Everyone learned that.
Okay,
not even outside of Indiana. We learned that one.
The borders are open.
Catchy and fun to say.
All right. Well, let's leave it there. Very fascinating. Hopefully, we debunked some American historical myth there. But Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.